Hi everyone, I'm John, the counter apologist, and I'm here with another reaction video, part two, to testify. Erik Manning's apologetic YouTube channel, where he is trying to give an evidential filter for miracle claims, which would allow things like the resurrection to pass, but let Christians reject a variety of other miracle claims. So I want to talk about this specific video, but then the general problems with this sort of approach in principle, right? Before I start, I want to say again, no insulting of Erik. I actually think he's a great guy. I've had wonderful interaction with him publicly and privately on this topic and others. So I think he's incorrect, but he's an honest interlocutor and he is a great person to talk to. So don't none of that stuff in the comments. I will start deleting things. All right. So I'm not going to go through the whole video. I'm just going to kind of cut to points to touch on the major spots here. So, the first thing is that Erik wants to find a middle road between dismissing miracle claims out of hand and being overly believing of just any old miracle claim. And I do want to point out that Christians like Erik have a problem because once you grant any miracle claim in the context of any other religion, the critical assumption underlying the resurrection argument that miracles are evidence for the truth of the theological teachings of the miracle worker goes out the window, and then the resurrection argument would not establish that one should be a Christian or that belief in Jesus is the only way to salvation, etc. And so, up front, the thrust of my objection is that coming up with a religiously neutral filter is never going to be exactly that. If you watch my first video in the series responding to Erik's objections to my criteria of what it would take to get me to believe and become a Christian, he already had a video on this, and it was Douglas Adams, I think, is a guy who responded to David Hume, and he had like a 3-step criteria, and now we have a new one, right? Like, what wasn't the old one good enough? I kind of alluded to this problem there, but I really want to go in depth here because this is far more contemporary. Basically, avoiding the sharpshooter fallacy when you are extremely motivated to find criteria that let your preferred miracles pass while eliminating many other testimonial miracle claims is basically going to be impossible. So if we were to go and look at uh, um, sorry about all this. So basically, what he's proposing is a standard put forward by Timothy McGrew. He's a contemporary apologist. He came up with the doubts filter, which is a fun name. He's a professor, and they like to come up with all sorts of fun little acronyms like this. So I just kind of want to go through bit by bit on each one of what each letter standing for and whether it's a good or bad criteria. So the first thing in there is D for distant events, right? So the idea is that if you have somebody who's writing in Greece, but they're talking about miracles in India, right? Then, that should be, something you would think is kind of skeptical. Like if I first reports of a miracle are from far away, then that's sort of a problem. Well, this is actually generally okay, but then you get into some kind of hairy territory because, like, how far is far, and the distance sort of matters relative to the time period that you're in. Like, it is, if I'm reporting a miracle, I live in New Jersey, and I say, New York, I report a miracle that happened in New York, I could get to New York in about an hour or so, or even less, depending on what part of Jersey I'm in. But I have a car. It's a long distance in the olden days when you had to walk, right, or maybe ride a horse. But so the like from a longer time ago, the distance thing is going to be a bigger problem. So like if you're in Greece reporting on things in that happened in Israel, right, that seems like a pretty good distance, and there's good reason to think that the Gospels were written in Greece, right? They were written by Greek speakers who referenced the Greek Septuagint, the translation of the what we call the Old Testament, or the Jewish Bible, really. So like where was Paul when he wrote a lot of his epistles? Was he far from Jerusalem? Was he there when the things happened, right? When he passed on the creed? Like everybody likes to point to 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul passes on a creed. Well, where was Paul when he wrote the letter, when he relayed the creed, right? So distance sort of can be an objection you'd bring up with the gospels themselves. Although not, I think, the strongest objection. So the next one, and this is an important bit, is in doubts is opinions already established. So I kind of covered this in my last video. Basically, this was used in the previous criteria, the most important one, where it basically lets them have a bias towards miracles that start a new religion in a hostile area. So the problems with this are that it's not really held to, right? So you would basically eliminate the vast majority of contemporary miracle claims about healings that are told happening in a Christian context to a majority Christian nation. So like the Craig Keener work, like this 1,000-page book, I think, would get like reduced down to almost a pamphlet if we applied this criteria to it. Now his example here, though, is extremely bad, and actually, I think this is the only bit of the video I'm going to play. I just wanted to listen to his example of establishing opinions already established of why we should reject these kinds of miracles. So here we go.
So, for example, we have reason to doubt Brigham Young's claim that Joseph Smith walked around house to house healing a large group of his followers from malaria while living in Illinois. Young was Smith's predecessor and had already recognized Smith as God's special prophet. There are very few details in the reports, and the people who preserved them weren't initially suspicious. They might have credulously latched onto any flimsy claim made about Smith. Next.
Okay, so what's really important here is that he claims Brigham Young already believed Joseph Smith was a prophet, and that the miracles were worked among other believers, and the testimony of these miracles were preserved yet again by other believers. So just like how the supposed eyewitnesses that were giving the testimony as the source to the actual writers of the Gospels all already believed Jesus was the Messiah, and the miracles were often worked for people who came to see Jesus believing he could heal them, at least, if not the Messiah, some kind of prophet that was touched by God, right? So we already have in the Gospels exactly the criteria that he's giving us of why we should reject the miracle claims that Brigham Young makes about Joseph Smith. And so why would I not reject the miracle claims that the apostles make about Jesus's miracles, right? Even if you to use it in that context, you've already kind of cut it against yourself. And we're going to go to the next letter here. So this is uncertain events, and I'm actually kind of good with this. This is basically the sort of implausible but physically possible miracles that I kind of go through in my initial countering the resurrection argument video. So basically, these sorts of things where you could never prove, like if it's the miracles, like I prayed for a cancer patient and went into remission, sort of a thing, right? Well, people in cancer spontaneously go into remission, not often enough, but it happens, especially in secular contexts and other religion contexts, right? So it's physically possible that these sorts of recoveries happen, although very implausible. But it's still, you can't know that it was actually a miracle. So this is unverifiable that God actually did something, right? Now, Erik gives a good example of the claim of levitating, right? So if like a prophet claim that his followers could levitate, but then like a street magician like David Blaine can like replicate the effect. But then like that's a pretty good thing of an uncertain example, except all the healing miracles that we get of Jesus, and contemporary ones for that matter, all happen in other religions. Like I don't think there's any major religion that does not have a healing miracle attributed to them, either of the original prophet or by people working in the name of the God that they're worshiping. So I think this is a bit of a problem for Erik to hold, and it can be applied to a vast majority of claims that are made, especially in the present day. Now, the thing here, the next thing for the B in doubts is belated reports. And this seems good, right? But what Erik gives in his examples are like very long distance in time. like hundreds of years. So like if you have a miracle that was being reported like 200 years later or something, like he's like that's a good reason to doubt that miracle claim, and I would agree. But how much time is belated, right? So honestly, the problem with this is that the amount of distance that the Gospels are reported and actually written is decades. Literally 30 years for the earliest Gospel, Mark, which has the least amount of miracle claims and ends before you actually see a risen Jesus, is 30 years. 30 years is a long time. If I told you, you know, something about a miracle that happened in Vietnam, and I was writing this to you somehow in the 80s, right? Like that's a long time. It's a big distance in time to make a claim of something that happened during like the Vietnam War, right? You would think that's a belated report, and I would just discredit it. But the Gospels are all like that, and then the later Gospels that have a lot more miracle claims than Mark do, including the crucial resurrection one, are even much later, and they copied from Mark. And we know that in Mark specifically, the earliest one, false supernatural stuff was added to it, right? So the end of Mark 16, where Jesus actually appears, and like they claim that like believers could drink poison and handle snakes, that was added. Those are false even then. Those believers could have like, drank poison and handled snakes and then died, right? So it was a demonstrably false claim of supernatural events happening or being able to be done. Um, and again, it's a long distance of time. So I think that even if we would hold to this, and generally I would almost like I would go with this, the Gospels are going to start to have problems here. So we're going to go here, and we're going to talk about the T in doubts, and this is trivial claims. Now, again, not really bad. The idea that he gives a good example of like if I make a claim that I'll like float it around this room and then turn into a donkey and then turn back, right? And and like that's just a miracle claim. Like God did that for me. What effect does this have on my life, right? So like it, the problem I go here is like what gets to count sort of as trivial, right? So if I claim that God did that to me in this room, I flew around and turned me into a donkey and turned me back. But it was the context of the Christian God after a session of like intense prayer, right? Is that count as confirming the Christian religion? What about healing miracles? Again, this is like one of the most common miracle claims, and if you just heal some random grandma that I've never heard of, and across the country or across the world, is that trivial to me? Like, what does that mean? Should I be believing in the theological teaching of the miracle worker if it was done in the name of the Christian God? What about the Islamic God, Hindu gods, Buddhist stuff, pagans all over the world, right? Like, is what becomes trivial. And this sort of in itself is like its own kind of it's ambiguous a bit of like what counts as trivial or not, but then we're going to have a conflict in a minute for the last, and I think probably his most controversial, well, not necessarily controversial one, but his last criteria. So we're going to go, here we go. So the S in doubts is self-serving, right? So this filter is a lot like the opinions already established criteria, in that it is trying to make things so you can keep the Gospels and the resurrection, but then get rid of a lot of other stuff. So note the criteria given here is basically he talks about wanting sex, political power, or money, right? Now, obviously those are good self-serving criterias, right? But then he's ignoring something. And this is going to apply to basically any miracle claim that's not trivial, right? So the trivial and self-serving are going to conflict here because establishing a religion and becoming a religious leader where you get to dictate the moral behavior of the society around you, or at least a large social group around you, is not trivial. It is self-serving to be like, you need to listen to me. I am a prophet of God, the creator of the universe, right? So this is not uncommon in like a small scale in like a lot of churches that pastors who get like really deeply involved in the personal lives of their congregation. A good example I can think of is there was a woman in this one church that I was a member of for a long time, and she made it her place to sort of police the dress of young women and teenage girls who came into the church. And if they were wearing something she thought was inappropriate, like it was too low cut or too sheer or too tight fitting of a skirt or something, she would go and be like, no, you need to stop this. And if they like blew her off, especially if they were like teenagers or just young adults, what she would do was she was a leader of the women's ministry, and she would get the other women in her group in the social circle who have standing in the church who would then put pressure on the person if the person kept coming to the church, right? She would get other people to come and go talk to her. And so she basically policed what the women could wear in the church based on what she thought was appropriate. And she was back it up with all sorts of Bible verses you can imagine in a conservative Christian church. Not hard to find verses to justify a dress code. And that's just like a very small scale. And imagine you're talking about becoming a prophet, right? So even in the Gospels, he sends out the disciples to like go into towns, and that if the town doesn't have people who will like put them up and feed them, like give them a place to sleep and give them food, right? While they as a reward or payment for their preaching, to just pass on by, right? So if you have this religious group that's growing and you hear about it, and the prophets come into your town, you're basically just getting food and shelter and whatever else and social appreciation, right? So that's in a way self-serving, right? There's almost no way that you can say, I am proclaiming a miracle. This justifies my theological teachings. Listen to me. I am a teacher, right? It comes with a certain level that's your mission. That's your job. You just get to stand there and talk and tell people how to behave, and you get money to pay for that. Like the pastors are paid. Pastors have a patronage, or a parsonage, excuse me, right? So like things like that were happening even in the context of the Gospels themselves. So now we've covered the criteria. I want to talk about his transition where he defends the Gospels themselves. So he wants to say that, hey, look, the Gospels will effectively pass these criteria, right? So Erik claims the resurrection was proclaimed weeks after the crucifixion, and the disciples stayed in Jerusalem even though there was persecution. Except the issue there is that we don't really know that. We have claims about when the resurrection was being preached from writings literally decades later. And the Gospels themselves are unclear at best, contradictory on their face, really, about whether or not the disciples stuck around in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. Again, the Gospels are written by anonymous authors literally decades after the event, and we know that false supernatural claims were added to the Gospels. So we don't know that they actually stuck around. We don't even have the reports aren't from actual people who were there, really, the ones that were written down. And he also claims that the opponents of the new religion had the means, motives, and opportunity to stop the spread. But let's say he says that at best he thinks the crucifixion was being preached 10 days after it happened, right? But if Jesus didn't rise from the dead and the body would have been either stayed on the cross or thrown into a mass grave or something, right? It would have been in a great state of decay at that point, right? Especially if you left it up on the cross. And if you're preaching in the city, right? The whole city of Jerusalem, even in the ancient time, was going to be pretty big. Not everybody knew what he even looked like. If the guy, you don't have speakers, you don't have video. So like if he's preaching something and there's this massive crowd around him, you're not even going to get a good look at the guy. So like if they show up with a body, and they're like, look, it's just like, he's on the cross. Look at him. Look at him. And they go, well, the disciples would be like, that's not Jesus. That's somebody else. That's just somebody else with a beard who looks like him a little bit. Or if it was decayed enough, they just go, that's not the body. They're misleading you. They're denying the Messiah of God, right? There's easy ways to come up with excuses if the resurrection didn't happen. To falsify that the resurrection didn't happen is going to be really impossible, especially if you're preaching it to a group of people who didn't know what Jesus looked like, right? So the means, motives, and opportunity is not really there. And then when you talk about importance, like this is an important miracle, basically any religion is going to be important. This is not hard for any religious miracle claim to meet, right? If you're talking about how you should live your life, how to be a moral person, right? That's important. Even if you just talk about like for how to live this life, when you start making claims about an afterlife and living forever, everything passes. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Mormonism, pick one, right? Anything gets the importance criteria. So like basically, if it's a religious claim, it's going to be it's going to pass that. So this is not really a particularly good like criteria of like the resurrection passes. So at the end of the video, Erik tries to head off my objection by basically calling this the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, and Erik says that this isn't self-serving because this criteria would cut against miracle claims he accepts, like Balaam's talking donkey earlier in the Bible. Now, first off, this kind of proves that it's the sharpshooter fallacy because he accepts a whole bunch of miracles that fail it, right? And so you're like, well, I believe those miracles based on the fact that the resurrection passes the filter, and Jesus believed in the Old Testament and preached as if the Old Testament was true, so therefore I would believe Balaam's talking donkey on the basis of Jesus being who he said he was because I believe the resurrection. The issue there is that any religion, especially well-established, is going to have a breadth of claims, right? And so all you need to do is find one that you can arguably get past this filter. And I've already brought up a number of objections about how the gospel resurrection miracles wouldn't pass this filter, right? So it's already contentious. And then all you need to do is build a case of like one miracle validated that would pass this, that you would believe, and then you use that to justify all the other past miracles that would not pass the filter, right? So you kind of have a lot to pick from. You're going to pick and choose, and then it lets you kind of bypass the filter for all the other stuff that you already accept. And again, when you have this, I have discussions with Erik and others who go on about Craig Keener or Caleb Jackson has a ton of miracle claims. A lot of them just don't pass this filter, but they all present this evidence as if it's evidence that miracles are happening in the contemporary society. So they're not really using the filter, is my point. So the other thing that Erik claims that this criteria is religiously neutral and obviously sensible, and it's just, but no, it's not. This is kind of like having a monkey, a fish, an elephant, and a snake, and then saying the neutral criteria to judge which is the best animal, or at least which animal should be fed first, is to see which one can climb a tree the fastest. Basically, you know what you want. You're gonna come up with stuff, and I think I've laid out why I think this McGrew's criteria was made by the Christian philosopher McGrew to make the key miracle claim of Christianity pass a filter while he can eliminate most others. Now, ironically, the original scenario I put forward in my first video on counting the resurrection would allow God, if it existed, to give us a truly objective method to give credence to historical miracle claims of the one true religion, and it would solve all of these exact problems. Basically, only allow religious leaders of the one true religion to perform contemporary miracles in a repeatable and verifiable way, and that gives us a contemporary experience of our present-day world that would let us interpret the claims of the past, which is what history does, and say, well, if only this one true religion can do miracles now, and all these other religions can't, well, then I'm going to give credence to the miracle claims of the one true religion that can do miracles right now. Right? That is a way that if God existed, God would have solved this problem from the get-go. And you would not have a case. It's a related argument about how God gave empirically verifiable miracles to a subset of people, namely the apostles, and then people like myself and others who would believe in the face of empirically verifiable miracles don't have it. So an all-loving God would give all people equal access to the stuff they need to believe, especially if our eternal salvation or avoiding damnation depended upon it. Thanks for watching.